bring our brother Marc up here, and he's titled his exhortation, A New Song. Marc?
Good morning. That was a good hymn. Thank you, Adam and Trent. But there's another song I want to start with, actually, and I need your help. So I'm going to start, and you can join in. Most of you will know this song. Maybe not everyone, but we're going to do it in the round. So I'll point to this side, and I'll point to this side. Ready? Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. Okay, that's great. Well, obviously you know the song. It's just singing in the round that's apparently a bit of a challenge, but that's okay. Now, like me, you probably obviously have heard this song many times. You maybe learned it in preschool or perhaps even earlier. Anybody not? There are people in this room I'm sure have never heard this song before. Raise your hand. What? Some of you I expected. There's one person in the back that's being interesting. Yes, lying. So this song, it paints a lovely picture for us, doesn't it? Just life is, in this boat, just kind of happily rowing downstream. I don't even think you need oars to go downstream. Just everything's merry and happy, and it's all very good. Enjoying good times and drifting along in life. But does this really reflect what life is like? I don't think so. The streams in our lives often have fallen trees blocking them, or submerged boulders waiting to capsize us. Perhaps your stream has dried up and your boat is scraping the bottom. Or on the other hand, maybe you've hit rapids and are barely able to control your boat or navigate that stream. And you may be in your boat screaming, "When do we get to the merrily, merrily, merrily part?" For most of us, life is anything but a dream. Although life does offer some periods of merriment, like the birth of a new child or grandchild, baptism of a new sister, a relief from physical or emotional ailment that we've been praying for, we do experience times of true joy, times like these. And it would be a sin to neglect the many blessings in life that our Heavenly Father does shower upon us if we only focused on the bad stuff. So we do need to remember that life does have some merry times, and we need to thank God for those times. But as a whole, our life's experience would not frequently be characterized as a blissful paddle down a gently flowing stream. This morning, I hope to demonstrate that we should be very glad that life is much harder than the smoothly flowing stream depicted in that childhood song. In the late 80s and early 90s, a group of scientists implemented a project called Biosphere 2. Many of you will know about this. Some of you won't. The plan was to create a self-sustaining, isolated environment replicating Earth's habitat. It was somewhere in Arizona, I don't know exactly where, but they built this habitat and they spent a lot of time and a great deal of money trying to replicate Earth's environment so they could study, and really I think the ultimate goal was possibly in space exploration or inhabiting another planet perhaps, because we're doing such a great job inhabiting this one. But as you can imagine, this project had quite a few problems. But one particular problem was that with trees, and although trees in Biosphere 2 grew faster than trees in Earth's natural environment, once they got to reach a certain height, they were not healthy and they would actually topple over. And so analysis of this issue determined that part of the problem was that there was no wind in Biosphere 2. The trees would therefore not produce what's evidently called stress wood. Now, I'd never heard of stress wood before, so let me explain to you what stress wood is. Stress wood is the result of small cracks in wood caused by wind. These cracks allow the tree not only to grow in the direction of sunlight, but also for development of structural strength in the wood. And so because the trees weren't under any stress, they were weak. They couldn't even support their own weight. And so they would fall because there was no wind in Biosphere 2. And we are not completely unlike trees. We need the stress in our lives to help us, in fact, to force us to develop strength. As Romans 5 puts it, we rejoice in hope of the glory of God. Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character, and character produces hope. The challenges we face in our everyday life creates in us the need for endurance. That endurance develops our character, or as the King James puts it, experience. And with that experience comes hope. We trust in something bigger than our sufferings, bigger than our tribulations, and we have hope. We have elpis. So you see that it is a cycle. It's a process. These verses start out talking about the fact that we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. And just as the process of wind stressing trees makes them gain strength, our trials and tribulations do the same thing for building our hope. But not just hope in relief of freedom from sufferings, but rather a hope in the glory of God. This is a much bigger, much better, much more important hope than just a hope in a merry paddle through life. As James 1 puts it, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. James is making the point that Paul is making in teaching believers that the hardship in your life results in a character more like God's. These are things to be counted as joy. A tested faith is a stronger faith. Faith that is stressed is a faith that is steadfast or patient. So does that mean that when our faith is stronger, we can better handle the trials in life? Yes, of course it does. But we must be careful here, because a strong faith can fool us into thinking it's by our strength that we endure these trials and tribulations, these turbulent waters in life, when really, this is God at work in us. Do we fool ourselves into thinking we can, by our own faith, stop rowing and try walking on the water? Yet this is the very sort of faith we desire, this kind of faith that would allow us to walk on water. And it makes me wonder if the lesson Peter learned by sinking into the sea because of his weak faith was perhaps the best possible outcome. Might he have swelled with pride had he perfectly replicated what his master was demonstrating by walking on the water? Would he have added justification to his argument that he would be the greatest of the 12 in the kingdom had he been able to do what the other disciples did not even attempt? And likewise, perhaps the trials we endure in this life serve us better than we realize. We can add to our prayers a thankfulness for these hardships, which teach us just how critically dependent on God's grace we really and truly are. So shifting gears just a bit, beyond the trials and tribulations we often face, sometimes God interrupts our merry rowing down the stream of life for his own purpose. There was a Lutheran pastor in the early 1900s named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he had a quote, maybe you've heard this before. He said, "We must be ready to allow ourselves to be interrupted by God." And so I think that as we consider this idea of being interrupted by God, not just being interrupted by God, but allowing ourselves to be interrupted by God. It's easy to come with a lengthy list of Bible characters whose lives were, in fact, interrupted by God. I think of Job. Job was living a pretty good life when he lost everything, seemingly for the sake of the salvation of his friends. Joseph. All was well at 17 until his brothers plotted against him. But as we know, he understood in the end that it was for God's purposes that he endured these things. Ruth was likely happily married, living in her own country, but God had something else, bigger and better, in mind for her. And so this list gets long quickly, because you think of Abraham and Daniel and Jeremiah and the things that they endured in their life because God had a purpose for them. Peter was fishing with his dad and his brother Andrew when Jesus came along and interrupted whatever life Peter otherwise would have lived when he said, "Come and follow me." Surely one of the biggest interruptions came to the life of Saul of Tarsus. Now, in this morning's reading, we find Saul heading to Damascus with a very clear purpose. He was passionate about his mission and no doubt a rising star among Pharisees. In Philippians, he writes about himself, saying, "If anyone thinks he has a reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. As to the law, a Pharisee. As to zeal, a persecutor of the church. As to righteousness under the law, blameless." Paul was zealous and righteous. Saul was blameless and righteous. Then his life was interrupted. In Acts 9, now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone round him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" He said, "Who are you, Lord?" He said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." Here, Saul's life was interrupted by Jesus, but for a bigger purpose. And in verse 13, Ananias seems to express doubt that this Saul of Tarsus is the right man Jesus is seeking. It's as if Ananias says, "Lord, I think you have the wrong person." He says in verse 13, "Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints at Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priest to bind all who call upon your name." But the Lord said to him, "Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake." And here's where we begin to see that Saul's rowboat is about to hit rough waters. Later in his writing to the Corinthians, Paul describes what a life interrupted can be like. He says in 2 Corinthians 11:22, "Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I know I sound like a madman, but I have served him far more. I have worked harder, I have been put in prison more often, been whipped times without number, and faced death again and again. 5 different times the Jewish leaders gave me 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Once I spent a whole night and a day adrift at sea. I have traveled on many long journeys. I have faced danger from my own people, the Jews, as well as Gentiles. I have faced dangers in cities, the deserts, and on the seas. I have faced danger from men who claim to be believers but are not. I have worked hard and long, enduring many sleepless nights. I have been hungry and thirsty and have often gone without food. I have shivered in the cold without enough clothing to keep me warm." But brothers and sisters and friends, the real message that we learn from the life of Paul pertains to the mindset needed when we understand that our life isn't our own. but rather it is Christ who lives in us. And that's what Saul learned and became Paul. He writes to the Philippians in the 4th chapter, I know how to be brought low and I know how to abound. And in every circumstance I've learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And so can we. And that's the message that Paul leaves for us. And we know that Paul goes on to write more of the New Testament than any other person. Though he was at his very core completely opposed to the teaching of Jesus as Messiah, Paul allowed his life to be interrupted in a way that causes us to marvel. King Saul didn't do that. Cain didn't do that. Judas Iscariot didn't. The generation which left Egypt didn't. The rich young ruler who met Jesus didn't allow their lives to be interrupted. And as Ananias pointed out, this Saul of Tarsus was the last person who would preach in Jesus' name. And yet he allowed the course of his life to be interrupted in the hugest way. So where do we stand? Do we cling so tightly to this life that we refuse to be allowed to have God interrupt our lives in a way which shows Christ to the world? This is the choice we make as we partake of this bread and wine. We show the Lord's death until he comes. In that same way, we need to show him in us when we are outside of these walls. This isn't easy rowing. We aren't floating merrily down the stream. We also aren't really the ones doing the hard rowing. Jesus has done that. And so what about Jesus? Would you say his life was interrupted by God? I don't think so. Right from the very beginning of creation, Jesus was intended by God. At no point was his life interrupted. It was always meant to be what it was. And not to say he didn't have a choice in the matter. He easily could have disobeyed his Father. He was tempted many times to do so. And when you consider the impact that Jesus has had on the world, it's astounding. I have an excerpt here I'd like to read you. It's from a book about the authenticity of Christ's resurrection. And the author lays out the obscurity of who Jesus was in contrast to his lasting impact on the world. He writes, Jesus was born in a tiny, irrelevant town in the Roman Empire and raised in another small village. He had to walk from one place to the next, and as an adult never traveled more than 200 miles from the town where he was born. He had none of the resources people use today to make an impact. No social media platform, no podcast audience, no clever videos, no website. He didn't even have the resources people used in the first century to make an impact. He never held political office, never ruled a nation, never led an army, never authored a book. His family was insignificant. The locals suspected he was an illegitimate son. His mother was a poor peasant woman. His father couldn't afford much. Jesus received an expensive education. Never married, never had children. Jesus didn't receive an expensive education. Never married, never had children, never owned a home of his own, and didn't possess more than the clothes on his back. As an adult, his brother was suspicious of his ministry, a work that ended after just 3 short years. Public opinion turned against him. Most of his followers abandoned him. One disciple betrayed him and another denied him. He was rejected by the religious, hunted by the powerful, mocked and unjustly persecuted by his enemies. He suffered an unfair trial, was publicly humiliated, brutally beaten, unduly executed in the most horrific way. Even then, the few followers who remained had to borrow a grave to bury him. And yet this is the man who changed history, inaugurated the common era, and forever transformed the most important and revered aspects of human culture. How is it possible that a single man, a man like Jesus, could have this impact? I think that's a powerful statement, because you look at the life of Jesus and you wonder, how are we still talking about him? When you just look at his life as the life of a man. Was Jesus' life interrupted? No, I don't think so. In the garden when he was struggling, and he said, should I ask to be saved from this hour? No, for this purpose I've come to this hour. Jesus, by his willingness to submit his life to the will of his Father, sacrificed himself to save us. We, brothers and sisters, are called upon to partake in his sacrifice by submitting our own will, our lives, to him, just as the Apostle Paul did. A happy, easy, peaceful life is but a dream. But a tested, dedicated, and submitted life is a life which holds eternal promise by him who created life and gave his Son to shepherd us, guide us, and in giving his own life to save us. In Revelation 5, we read in verse 9 about a new song. Not row, row, row your boat. And they sang a new song, saying, "Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you are slain by your blood. You ransomed people for God, from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you have made them a kingdom of priests to our God, and they shall reign on earth." And finally, in conclusion, Philippians 1:6. "And I am sure of this," writes Paul, "that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ." May you rejoice at the interruptions God may bring in your life this week. May you be ready to allow those interruptions to change you. May you endure this week's challenges in the hope of the glory of God. And may you prepare yourself to learn that new song.